Hi, this is Don Mirma. I want to record this video to share with you the books that have most influenced my perspective on music and aesthetics. I'm the host of Quick to Listen, which is a podcast dedicated to philosophical and spiritual discussions of music. But that all sounds rather broad, so hopefully this will help you get more of a sense of where the show is coming from and just give you some cool stuff to read. First up is Beethoven, His Spiritual Development by J.W.N. Sullivan. I've read 5 or 6 books on Beethoven, and this is my favorite because this will not provide you with the biographical background. So this is a psychological profile. This book knows at its core that Beethoven never evolved in his art without having evolved concurrently or slightly earlier as a man. And it tracks just why it is that he went into a heroic phase and how it is that the heroic phase evolved into the late quartets. That kind of perspective of never losing sight of the human being creating the art is something that I hope we do in the podcast. Let's Talk About Love by Carl Wilson. This is from the 33 1/3 series, and it was expanded with additional essays from people, but the core book of it is his 33 1/3 exploration of all albums, Celine Dion's Let's Talk About Love, which was her post-Titanic album. What he talks about is ultimately the currency, the social capital currency that is always in play when we talk about music. And if you're going to have a pure spirit with the way that you approach music, you have to be very cognizant of that. Am I doing this because I'm going to get social capital out of it? There's nothing wrong with that in itself. It's sort of inevitably a game that we have to play, he points out. And it is simply a well-researched bio of Celine Dion. I found her very sympathetic, and I came away, I spent like a weekend listening to her, trying to like her. I didn't end up liking her, but neither is she, trash. This is why I covered Justin Bieber on the second episode of the podcast. In researching that episode, I came away liking a lot of his music. He has great songwriters working for him. He's a talented guy. If you're downvoting the Baby video, you're a negative asshole. Jan LaRue, Guidelines for Style Analysis. I'm a songwriter, but I'm always trying to read about theory and traditional Western composition, and this is the best book I've encountered in that world. It's also perfectly applicable to songwriting and other forms of music. LaRue boils down the analysis of music to SHMERG, the SHMERG system, which is an acronym standing for sound, harmony, melody, rhythm, and growth. Sound, these are 5 axes on which you can begin to coherently talk about what's actually happening in a piece of music. So sound would be the texture, the arrangement. Harmony, melody, rhythm, and growth is how the piece develops over time. Its internal language with itself, where it goes with its conversation with itself. The next thing is somebody's thesis. It's available for free online. I'll put up the link. It's by Rob Schultz, and it's called Tonal Pairing and the Relative Key Paradox in the Music of Elliott Smith. When I was originally planning out this podcast, I was going to go a very different route with it. I was going to do a podcast that was entirely dedicated to my hero, Elliott Smith. And in seeking out the best writing that exists on Smith, I came across this. Schultz has identified the key to Smith's language, which is ambiguity. He talks about lyrics and the more standard stuff as well, but the ability, almost optical illusion-like ability of Smith song to oscillate between hope and despair. Sometimes that comes across in a play on words that could be literally taken two different ways, but it's also in the tonal language. He has songs often that could be in two different keys. So Elliott Smith is a genius. This is will help you appreciate that fact more. Infinite Music, Imagining the Next Millennium of Music Making. This is by Adam Harper, who was a recent guest on Quick to Listen. It is the book that made modern music make sense to me. Like most people, I listen to music sensually. I want it to sound pleasing in some way. And as a result, I have not been able to follow the Bergs into 12-tone and serialism. The radical sort of experimentation and reassessment of the boundaries of music that has characterized much new composition to this day. It's called Infinite Music because Harper acknowledges that music ultimately can be anything, any sound. I mean, in the post-Cage world, that is the state of affairs. And then he tackles the issue of coherence. How do composers get bearings within that world? He suggests that composers focus on variables and music's variability, and even the most radical piece of music, you can identify what about that piece is varying and get a handle on it. And the way that Harper talks about alien music, the ability of a composer to make something that is only speaking its own internally consistent yet alien language, something that has not grown off of the branch of music history in an organic way, is very exciting. I hope to encounter alien music. The Seven Lamps of Architecture by fellow Brit John Ruskin came out in 1880, and Ruskin is talking about aesthetic principles that he thinks undergird quality architecture. He had a very conservative sensibility. It is the late 19th century. Iron was beginning to widely be used in British architecture. He recoiled against iron. It was too easy to mass produce. It was cheap. It lacked meaning. Ruskin writes in an intense, I think almost mad way, where he sees meaning in the tiniest aesthetic components, and it certainly applies across media, not just to architecture. If you're curious, the 7 lamps that will light our way, he looks to Gothic architecture. That's his ideal. Are sacrifice, truth, power, beauty, life, memory, and obedience. And really the two core things, the two things that relate to objective qualities, not spiritual qualities, he's a deeply spiritual man, are power and beauty, which parallel Edmund Burke's sublimity and beauty. Edmund Burke is fantastic, but this book manages to kind of build off of Burke in a more elaborated, but more useful, rich way. Salvador Dalí, 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship. Dalí in this book explains, he lays it all out. Here's how I make my art. If you read about aesthetics too much, you can become too left brain about it, too rational. You can get the delusion that it can be all boiled down to something. I love that despite being superb on a technical level, maybe painters would disagree with me, but I think that's the case with Dalí. Despite that, Dalí, in the end, chalks it up to magic, and he talks about these kind of crazy rituals that he does, like taking a 1-second nap where you fall asleep with keys in your hand, and then as you nod off, you drop the keys to the ground, you wake up. All this fun stuff that begins to build the picture of how this man created the mindset of a Dalí for himself. But yes, at the beginning he does talk about pigmentations and technical things as well. The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes came out in the late 70s. He's a psychologist and an anthropologist, and this is a theory of human consciousness that is not directly about art, although he certainly talks about ancient art and the Elliott and things like that, and hand-carved god iconography. Julian Jaynes is my Sigmund Freud. This is my best model of how the brain works, and it's such a vast book, it's difficult to talk about, but it has direct relevancy to music. For one thing, he talks about auditory hallucinations in great depth, and he talks about the different functionality of the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere connects to your right ear and vice versa. They're switched. So right there, it gives you interesting things to consider when you're mixing a song. Do I want the person's right hemisphere to register this guitar first, or is this guitar tone more of a left hemisphere thing? The Van Gogh Blues by Dr. Eric Maisel. The Creative Person's Path Through Depression. Maisel is a distinguished psychotherapist, but he talks about depression in a unique way. He talks about it as being inevitable for the creative individual, because what creativity is a struggle to make meaning, and what depression is a crisis of meaning. That paradigm is valuable for if you're an individual who has felt depressed or just felt despondent and that life was empty and lacking meaning. He encourages people to, really he's an adjunct of Sartre. He encourages people to heroically make meaning for themselves, to force meaning. With Quick to Listen, that's ultimately all that I'm interested in, is how is this musician making meaning? How are they wrestling with that? The Tao Te Ching. The Tao has everything to do with art. The Tao is a sensibility. The Tao is an ethos. The Tao is a place where you can forget your theories about art. Artists work with negative space. An idea of the Tao is that you raise four walls to make a room, but it's the space inside that you occupy.
This will make you listen to music in a different way. It will make you make music in a different way. It may make you decide to not make music at all anymore. It's fantastic.
Please leave a comment. Tell me what books about music or art you have gotten a lot out of.